Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The Progressive Era in the South, 1890s through the 1920s. We'll discuss three topics in this lecture: the difference between capital P progressive, as in the Progressive Era, and lowercase p contemporary political label progressivism. We'll discuss an overview of national progressivism in the 30 years from 1890 to about 1920 or so, and how the U.S. South experienced and participated in the movements of the progressive era during that same period. Because the current political labels progressive and progressivism make some people turn off their historical perspective and lead them to conflate the early years of the 20th century with today, let's define our terms now. Progressivism, with a capital P, along with its other permutations and forms, is a label historians have applied to a historically specific era in the United States beginning around 1890 and ending in the 1920s. The ending date of the so-called Progressive Era actually is a point of historiographic contention, with some maintaining that World War I did end the era, while others argued that it lasted through the New Deal, at least in a different form. Historian Ellis Hawley leads this latter school of thought, writing that progressivism through legislation gave way to progressivism through administration into the 1920s and 30s. My take on this question follows Hawley, so too will this lecture. Capital P progressivism, then, has agendas and characteristics that are more or less specific to the era of the early 20th century. We'll examine many of those in this lecture. A number of these programs don't seem to us to be particularly progressive, and in some cases they are downright reactionary. But progressives of that era explain themselves through the language of progress, even when it does not ring true to our ears. So why call the era progressive at all? Because in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt ran for president under the banner of a third party, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Reading the sources in the history of that era led historians to call it after the name of Roosevelt's party. Is the appellation just? Maybe, maybe not. But it's convenient, as is the way we periodize it. Lowercase p progressivism, on the other hand, is a post-World War II label for a tendency in the American political left. The term was revived in the 1948 presidential election by Henry Wallace, FDR's third-term vice president 1941 to 1945, who ran far to the left of Harry Truman. After Truman defeated Wallace and Thomas Dewey that year, the label progressive fell to nasty language as a rabid anti-communism spread. Commie, pinko, fellow traveler. These were epithets foisted upon anyone on the political left, and they stuck until Ronald Reagan famously turned the label liberal into a catch-all for the political left. Since 2000, the left wing of the Democratic Party, as well as those who identify as social democrats and even socialists, have reclaimed the label. This is why we hear so much about it now, and why it gets conflated with the early 20th century's progressive era. This isn't to say that there are no connections between progressivism then and progressivism now, only that when we talk about that historical era, we must not apply current ideas backwards to it. We should be particularly careful about making value judgments about any historical era based on our ideas and values of today. Doing so is called presentism, and it's a problem in historical methods. Let's look now at the contours of progressivism at the national level. First, we want to discuss some of the concepts that underlay the progressive movement. The first of these ideals is that the government should be an agent for making people's lives better. This is in stark contrast to the 18th century concept of government as an entity that must be restrained, and of the 19th century idea that government serves the interest of property rather than people. Progressives didn't believe that government alone should work for the people's benefit, but that it did have a positive role to play in protecting the weak from the strong. Because many progressives feared mob rule, and for other reasons, At the same time they thought that government should benefit the people, they believed that government should be in the hands of responsible parties who happen to look just like them. Thus, nationally, progressives wanted expanded democratic forms, but a narrowed electorate. By them, in my look just like them comment above, refers to the burgeoning middle class of industrial managers, small business people, and professionals like lawyers and editors who made up the great body of progressives. This middle class had expanded dramatically in the Gilded Age and did not yet have a real place in the American body politic or in the social order. Progressivism was a movement they designed to put themselves into the forefront of American politics and to break into the national economy dominated by capitalists and workers at war with one another. As a movement to instill order, harmony, and what they thought of as progress into a frighteningly rambunctious era of rapid change, progressives wanted to define the characteristics of proper living and either get other classes to accept their definitions or force others to do so through the power of the state. One area we see this operating is in business regulation schemes that we'll discuss in a bit, and in offering reforms in areas of American life they thought were stagnant or inadequate. Now there's a word of caution here. Progressives had ideas about foreign policy, but because our focus is on Southern progressivism and states have inconsequential foreign policies, we will only discuss progressivism as it relates to domestic policies. This slide shows the topics we'll cover in our discussion of how nationwide progressivism looked and acted. Because we covered these in greater detail in HIS 4414, I just want to provide an overview of them here. This is to say that I'll make assertions and provide examples of what I'm talking about, but I will not make a detailed, evidence-laden, compelling argument. From the standpoint of historical method, I will rely on my professional authority to convince you that my discussion is legitimate. Be aware that other historians emphasize other things, and that there are many things that occurred during the Progressive era that I will not cover at all. Our march through these topics will pass through responsible citizenship and enhanced democracy, regulation of business, efficiency, and social justice and humanitarianism. We'll talk about disfranchisement movements of blacks and poor whites in the South later, but suffice it to say at this point that national progressives were not anxious to expand the pool of voters, particularly immigrants. In fact, when the women's suffrage movement revived after 1910, one of its chief arguments was that enfranchising women would double the pool of white middle-class voters. So let's talk about expanded democracy for those who could vote, which was a definite thrust of progressive political ideology. The idea was that it was right and proper to channel all political activity through the established electoral process rather than have politics erupt in the streets or in ungovernable third parties. By expanding opportunities for the people to be heard, thus disciplining the elites who held power in their legislatures and the party system, progressives could install their sense of order and channel progress without disruption. Progressives in many states supported party primaries to replace political convention backroom deals in producing candidates. This movement began for statewide office in South Carolina in 1896, at least in part as a way of disfranchising blacks. Primaries spread to the presidential elections by the 1920s and were white only. That history is complicated, but white-only primaries survived judicial review until the late 1940s. Primary elections let the voice of at least some of the people be heard when electing governing officers. But the legislative process was still full of backroom dealing. So some states adopted initiative and referendum to get bills before the legislature or before the people directly when lawmakers refused to hear them. Not many states adopted these measures, but we hear of some, like California and Oregon, whereby using petitions a group can get a proposed law onto the ballot. If passed, that ballot measure is the same as a law passed in the legislature. Recall is different. It is an election during an office holder's term to see if that person retains the office. Usually begun by a petition of opponents, a recall election usually has two parts. Should the person stay or go, and if go, who replaces them? The most recent high-profile recall elections in recent times was the 2003 California recall of Governor Gray Davis that replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the 2012 failed recall of Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin. Because of these cases, many people ask why office holders they don't like can't just be recalled. The answer is that few jurisdictions have recall, and the federal government definitely does not. Another expansion of democracy during the Progressive era was the 17th Amendment to the Constitution that made possible the direct popular election of senators. Formerly, state legislatures elected senators, but many of those had senator preference elections that allowed the people to indirectly elect senators. This amendment took out the middleman, so to speak, of the state legislatures, who many people rightly considered corrupt, and put the power into the hands of the electorate. A second manifestation of the ideology of national progressivism was the regulation of business, especially corporations. The general corporate form was new in the last third of the 19th century, and legal thinking had not caught up with its presence. In fact, people's conception of what was economically right and wrong had not taken in the corporation, and so many felt corporations were wrong for the U.S. Corporations also banded together in trusts, which were declared illegal over and over, and holding companies that allowed corporations to own stock. Now today that's common, but then it was very novel for reasons we won't discuss here. Corporations took advantage of their power, and representatives of the people offered a number of remedies, including government ownership. Other representatives made peace with the idea of general corporations and only sought redress when they became abusive. President Theodore Roosevelt, nicknamed the Trust Buster, though his successor William Howard Taft actually busted many more trusts than TR, opened that door by having the Attorney General prosecute so-called bad trusts like Standard Oil and Northern Securities. Another manifestation of business regulation rather than destruction was the push for a strong Interstate Commerce Commission, particularly for railroad regulation. This has been part of the Farmers Alliance and Populist Party programs that the progressives picked up. Over the years, Congress strengthened both the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, and railroad controls to benefit shippers and stabilize the transportation network. The Federal Hepburn Act of 1906 did this. Supported by Roosevelt, it gave the ICC rulings the force of law, provided for setting maximum railroad rates, prohibited government officials from receiving free passes, forced standardized bookkeeping, and required annual reports to the ICC. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 are examples of government regulations of unfettered corporations. Reaction to the unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry reached a climax with the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. He said he had aimed at America's heart, but hit her in the belly. And Congress thereafter created a regulatory regime that prohibited adulteration or mislabeling of foods, medicines, and alcohol. It also opened the way to inspectors and authorizing procedures for drugs. The most potent mechanisms for federal regulation then as now was the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. A third component of progressive ideology was the belief, the apotheosis really, of efficiency and rationalization of processes. This manifested in the belief that all problems in government and business and even in human lives were amenable to technical solutions powered by experts. This valued not only the notion of technology but also of expertise, especially of the medical doctor and the engineer. Many occupations followed the leads of these two professions and how they went about their work. Social workers, for instance, switched to a casework model of supplying welfare, and manufacturing employed engineers to make their operations more cost effective. Articulating this ideal was Frederick Winslow Taylor, a self-taught engineer and proponent of what is called scientific management. He developed that field through time studies of work, after which he proposed designs of workflow to use the least time to get a job done. He also proposed payment for piecework and was instrumental in moving control of work processes from foremen and workers to managers. His disciples, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, later added motion studies. Progressives also believe that government too should be rationalized. We see this manifested in the movement to adopt the city commission form of government that emerged from the devastating hurricane that destroyed Galveston, Texas, and killed over 6,000 in 1901. The city government, operating under the mayor-council form, was unable to cope with the aftermath, so a group of businessmen petitioned the Texas legislature for a charter change and established a new city government. The resulting city commission members were elected at large rather than from wards or districts, and rather than represent the people, were administrators in charge of government functions as if they were managers of a business. This worked in Galveston and spread by 1920 to over 500 cities, though in modified forms. The final idea that we'll discuss here is the so-called Wisconsin idea of government. Governmental decisions were often made based on political calculations, log rolling, or plain old seat-of-the-pants action. The Wisconsin state government under Governor Robert La Follette, later senator and presidential candidate known as Fighting Bob, embraced the idea that government policy should be based on research. He harnessed the University of Wisconsin system as a legislative and administrative adjunct to provide studies during the legislative process. Other states and the federal government were using departments and consultants to provide factual data for legislative and administrative decision making. But the Wisconsin idea created a system and infrastructure for these activities. La Follette pushed robust research for lawmaking into the Republican platform, and it spread throughout the U.S. over time. Finally, national progressives sought social justice and humanitarian treatment of those they thought needed help. Yes, their attitude was patronizing and controlling. They not only wanted to help, but wanted to diffuse potential uprisings brought on by misery. And many of their proposals made it harder for businesses to profit from what progressives considered exploitation of the vulnerable. Progressives advocated for limits on child and female labor. They fought for and secured legislation for shorter hours and against night work, as well as minimum age limits for child workers. There was an entire movement at the state and national level, especially against child labor. This coincided with state-level campaigns for compulsory school attendance laws. After all, if kids below 14 couldn't legally work, they should go to school. These campaigns met with mixed success. Progressives argued for occupational safety laws. There were many muckraking reports about working conditions in various industries, but the catalyst for change was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York City in 1911. In it, 143 workers, mostly young women, fell or jumped to their deaths rather than being burned alive. Bad storage practices, locked doors, and fire equipment that did not reach high enough to save the workers led to New York to form an industrial commission under Francis Perkins that investigated and proposed new laws. Francis Perkins went on to become President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor in the 1930s. Another area of social justice animated by national progressive women was the women's suffrage movement. The movement to secure the vote for women languished in the 1890s but revived after 1910. One of the original marches on Washington was the March 1913 suffragist parade that inaugurated the revitalized movement. Under the leadership of conservative society women like Carrie Chapman Catt, They argued that women's votes would mirror their husbands and secure white supremacy at the ballot box. After a doggedly determined campaign that saw some advocates jailed and even tortured, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919. Tennessee's ratification by one vote, after a holdout legislator's mother called him during the session and told him to vote in favor, put it over the required number of states. We turn our attention now to how the South experienced the Progressive era. Remember, it shared a great deal with how the rest of the nation experienced this era and was influenced by the economic, political, and social conditions from which Southern progressives sprang. Chief among these were the dominance of agriculture, the lack of a large local upper class, and the centrality of white supremacy. We should note that neither in the nation nor in the South was progressivism a unified operation of any kind. It was a movement of like-minded individuals and groups who may or may not have worked together or even toward the same ends, except for things they could identify as progress. Even that meant different things to different people. And we see the movement operating under local traditions and influences more so than did the progressives of the industrialized Northeast and Midwest. Historian Dewey Grantham, probably the most important synthesizer of research on what we identify as Southern progressivism, wrote in 1983 that Southern progressivism reconciled progress with tradition. It did so through the medium of the Southern middle class, who not only constructed a shared culture, but also successfully identified their class interests as the most important public interests. Another contour in this story is that progressive movement in the South experienced a pair of changes between 1910 and 1913, when Southerner Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. The first of these was a change from missionizing for progressive reform, that is calling attention to problems and proposing progressive solutions, usually done by individuals, to forming organizations to work toward progressive goals. This process had been going on since the beginning of the era, but we see the fading of the individual agitator in favor of organizational work during this stretch. Another change is that much agitation had been successful at the state level, so Southern progressives turned their eyes to the federal government to complete their programs. The remainder of this talk will sketch out three areas of concern that progressives campaigned to reform: social and economic control, justice and humanitarianism, and efficiency and economic development. These are analytical categories, and in many cases you might think one of my examples fits better into another category or into multiple categories. This is completely legitimate. I often think the same thing. This is one way of looking at this history. Other ways are legitimate too, if they follow solid historical methods. We're able to scratch the surface only. There are libraries of articles and books that discuss various progressive era campaigns, and more can be written by people like you. Let's begin by examining social and economic control campaigns, most of which aimed at using the power of the state to aid economic development and create an orderly society in the aftermath of 30 years of industrial, economic, and political turmoil. One of the most important of such campaigns in the South was disfranchisement, the narrowing of the electorate to only those who could exercise their vote responsibly. Voting to the progressives was a privilege rather than a right, and limiting the franchise was, to them, political hygiene. Disfranchisement was supposed to shift African American attention to economic betterment and to reduce the temptation for white politicians to steal black votes. White voters outside the Black Belt agreed, because planters controlled the votes of their African American workers through threats and intimidation. Remember, voting was done publicly by casting tickets into glass jars. From 1880 through 1908, Southern states either amended their constitutions or passed statutes that limited voting to responsible people. Such tactics included the white-only Democratic primary that functioned as the de facto election, cumulative poll taxes paid annually in order to vote, and any years you missed had to be made up before being allowed to vote, literacy tests, so-called understanding tests, property qualifications, and long residency requirements. To avoid disfranchising poor whites who might be caught by restrictions, most states implemented the so-called grandfather clause, introduced first in Louisiana, that exempted a person from literacy tests if they, their father, or their grandfather was eligible to vote as of January 1st, 1867, before the adoption of the Louisiana Reconstruction Constitution. This, of course, was aimed at retaining white farm votes, but as time went on, it reduced the poor white electorate as well. Additionally, the sheer complication of voting also reduced the number of voters. Here are some examples of how effective the system was. The number of black votes in Louisiana dropped from 130,000 in 1897 to 1,300 by 1904. The number of white voters declined there too, from 164,000 to 92,000. A similar control campaign, made possible by disfranchisement that stripped political voice from African Americans, was the legalization of racial segregation we call Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were passed by state and local governments that did not represent those to whom the law applied. As time went on, Jim Crow laws became more draconian and more humiliating. Progressives in the South were just as interested in corporate regulations as they were in other parts of the United States, even when promoting corporate regulations flew in the face of New South boosterism. Regulations sprang from the Farmers Alliance and Populist Party platforms and were aimed at taxing out-of-state businesses and reducing the cost of entrance by small businesses. Consequently, we see laws establishing state insurance commissions, taxing out-of-state fire and life insurance companies, requiring licensing of insurance agents, requiring performance bonds be deposited with the state, and even requiring a percentage of company profits to be reinvested in the state. A 1906 report by New York State on the insurance industry, including its use of funds to influence regulations, led to an expansion of regulation in the South. Another area of corporate regulation was the forbidding of foreign companies, out-of-state companies, from doing business in a state. Alabama had such a law, which led companies headquartered elsewhere to buy Alabama companies or create dummy corporations in the state. U.S. Steel, the giant conglomerate built by J.P. Morgan and the first U.S. company valued, it turns out fraudulently, at $1 billion, bought Birmingham company TCI as its Alabama venture. In another case during World War I, shipbuilding companies funded by federal contracts in Mobile, Alabama, created dummy corporations. U.S. Steel created the Chickasaw Shipbuilding Company, and Kelly Atkinson of Chicago operated as the Mobile Shipbuilding Company. But the railroads received the brunt of most regulatory campaigns. Railroad lawyers sat as legislators and even as governors in the state in the late 19th century, and railroads saw very, very tolerant laws passed that aided their profits. On the other hand, farmers and manufacturers saw transportation costs as a real impediment to their own profits and even livelihood, while they and passengers bristled at the unaccountability and arrogance of railroads that hiked rates seemingly at random. Most southern states had railroad commissions, but most of those were toothless. Some states, Alabama is the exemplar, made railroad regulation the centerpiece of political progressivism during the era. Textile manufacturer B.B. Comer wanted rail rates lowered, so he finally secured a seat on the Alabama Railroad Commission. Finding out that the commission could do nothing, he was elected governor. In 1907, Comer pushed through scads of regulatory bills, including one that removed the operating license of any railroad that pulled a suit from state court into federal court, largely because the federal judge in any such trial was Thomas Good Jones, a railroad lawyer who had been an Alabama governor himself. The smaller lines gave into the regulatory regime, including rate reductions in the state, but the L&N fought back. This resulted in a stalemate in court until the parties settled in 1914. By that time, new federal laws increased railroad regulations and tended to remove rate cases from state jurisdiction. The epitome of social control campaigns during this era, however, was prohibition. Take a moment to look at the map that forms the background of this slide. It's a 1910 map of wet, dark, and dry, light, counties in the U.S. Before passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, mandating nationwide prohibition of alcohol, states tried to regulate its use and distribution. Options states tried included establishing what was called dispensaries, state licensed retailer of alcohol, and so-called local options, in which localities voted whether to be wet or dry. For the moral crusaders against drink, the ranks of which contained many progressives, nothing short of full prohibition would suffice. State-level prohibition sometimes worked, and other times didn't. Some states tried it for a few years until wet forces could reclaim legislatures. Eventually, the national campaign to make everyone sober and righteous succeeded, at least from 1919 to 1934, but only in making booze illegal. Progressives sought social justice for the downtrodden, examples of which were penal reform, child labor reform, and educational reform campaigns. The motivation for these often came from the social gospel movement that animated so much of progressivism. But in the South, every campaign was conducted within the bounds of white supremacy and the progressive sense of noblesse oblige and paternalism. This does not mean that social justice campaigns did not benefit African Americans, just that the campaigns were not aimed at benefiting African Americans. Penal reform campaigns tried to halt the convict lease system and create separate facilities and even court systems for juveniles, women, and the infirm. State and county leasing of convicts to private concerns stretched back to the antebellum prisons, but the system that arose after the Civil War was much harsher. Earlier, the prison was leased to a business that used prison facilities and prisoners to manufacture goods, but later the prisoners were turned over to private businesses. Not only did the government entity get money per prisoner, they didn't have to pay for prisoner upkeep. Because they were basically free workers, prisoners got the worst possible and most dangerous jobs. Casualties were high, particularly in extractive industries like mining and naval stores. Convict lease was repugnant even to people then, but it was profitable enough that states had a hard time letting go. 16% of Alabama's state income was from convict lease. This does not count the savings that states made from not having to care for prisoners. Needless to say, conditions for prisoners were extraordinarily poor, appalling even. Those states that did get rid of convict lease early, Mississippi in 1894, Tennessee in 1896, Louisiana in 1901, for example, still thought prisoners should not be a financial drain on the state. Prisons became manufacturing plants or farms, and in some, prisoners worked on roads on chain gangs. Progressives campaigned for chain gangs across the South as a reform measure, which it was compared to the horrors of lease. Counties tended to give up prisoner lease before states did, and the last state to do so, you guessed it, Alabama in 1928. This occurred after a major scandal in 1926 and with the levying of gasoline taxes to replace the lost revenue. Even then, Alabama let its convicts stay leased 6 months longer than its white convicts. The national movement to establish juvenile courts opened with the founding of such a court in Chicago in 1899, with a number of southern cities following suit in the first decade of the century. Because state legislatures were dominated by rural interests and juvenile courts were an urban phenomenon, few states passed significant legislation about separate courts until much later. Some states did develop reform schools to keep young children away from county and state convicts and to treat their problems less as criminality and more as casework. Rightly so, too, as many juveniles in the system were abandoned rather than delinquent. The use of this kind of language harkens to the rise of experts in child welfare and psychology, new fields that arose in the progressive era. Other child-centered campaigns include a reform of labor laws to stop exploitation of small children by manufacturers and education reform. Child labor reform became a pressing issue as workers argued that children under 14 or 16 be prohibited from working in manufacturing, thus holding down wages, and studies showed that up to 30% of mill hands in the South were 10 to 15 years old in 1900. The campaigns began in earnest in the South with the founding of the Alabama Child Labor Committee by Episcopal priest Edgar Gardner Murphy in 1901, though some states had passed weak laws in prohibiting child labor as early as the 1870s. By 1903, Murphy's committee and its agitation had secured better laws in 3 states. Then the impetus passed to the National Child Labor Committee. As a result of concerted effort, particularly bolstered by the photographs of Lewis Hines, state and federal laws reduced the number of children under 14 working in textile mills to 2% in Alabama and 6% in the Carolinas. In related moves, concerns over child welfare led to campaigns to improve education. Literacy across the South was low, with as many as 20% of whites and 50% of African Americans unable to read. Schools were open only 4 months per year in most areas, and per pupil spending was far less than half the national average. Exacerbating this was the segregation of children by race, which required maintaining dual systems of schools. As you might suspect, separate was not at all equal, and tax-averse states went to great lengths not to fund black schools. One abysmal trick was to divide communities into races, then allow school taxes to each race in proportion to how much of the school tax each race paid. Since property was the only real source of tax funds, and since whites owned so much more property than blacks, this formula was very punitive. The Rockefeller Foundation stepped in by funding not only the National General Education Board, but also the regional Southern Education Board. The SEB agitated and lobbied localities, legislatures, and the people to increase funding of all schools with the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. The campaigns were successful. In 1908, the U.S. Commission of Education reported that from 1900 to 1906, Louisiana's state school appropriations had risen 127%, and its local funding had risen 111%. North Carolina's state appropriations doubled, but its local funding grew by an astounding 27 times. Georgia's appropriation grew by 1/3, and its local funding up to 160%, and Tennessee's funding grew by 79% and 42% respectively. This did not bring the Southern average up to the national average, but it was substantially better than what it would have been without the SEB campaigns. In addition, school reform bills began to require training for teachers, then licensing, as well as longer school years. Reforms continued into the 1930s. The Rockefeller Foundation was not the only philanthropy to engage the South. Julius Rosenwald, head of the retail giant Sears and Roebuck, and a great friend of Booker T. Washington, provided grants to African American communities to erect schoolhouses. The Rosenwald Fund also provided plans for different kinds of buildings that provided the most advanced accommodations such as adequate light, ventilation, and sanitary privies. Over the 2 decades from 1912 to 1932, Rosenwald funds helped erect close to 5,000 schools across the South. Closely allied with social justice was humanitarianism, which was an area of special concern to progressive women. This is to say that women during the era found the somewhat cloistered world of separate spheres, men in public and commercial life, women at home, opened up with the disruption of the Gilded Age and the greater egalitarianism that emerged as a defining characteristic of the progressive era middle class. Women were active in social justice campaigns and in many social control campaigns, but we also see women taking on more prominence in social welfare casework and other public activities. In many ways, Southern women began to mirror the activities of their Northern sisters in clubs and what has been called municipal housekeeping campaigns, like the promotion of kindergartens in parks and cities. Others filled the ranks of librarians, and still others signed on as home demonstration agents, similar to county agricultural agents, but with improving rural home life as its goal. Middle class and elite white women formed distinct women's clubs beginning in the early 1890s. Most of these were mission societies attached to churches, study clubs, or mutual interest clubs. Others were service organizations like the Mothers Club that tended to schools and ultimately formed the core of what became the PTA, now the PTO, in the 20th century. African American women, too, organized clubs for similar reasons, though they tended to be more open to working class women and focused on racial uplift and community service. Each race organized local clubs into state and national associations. The White General Federation of Women's Clubs formed in 1890, and the National Association of Colored Women formed in 1896. Margaret Murray Washington, wife of Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee, led the Alabama clubs and became the 5th president of the National Association in 1912. Women also organized in communities and states to promote suffrage, but also to argue against suffrage. We've already covered suffrage a little bit, but suffice it to say that the so-called new women of the South were committed to either side of this question. Because it's a bit of an anomaly in how we talk about history, here's some of the objections to women's voting from women. Most of the objections were due to conservatism, particularly a desire to retain separate spheres of activity and a fear that by taking on political responsibilities that women would become less female. In the South, however, a strain of anti-suffrage erupted during the fight over ratification of the 19th Amendment. Prominent women opposed suffrage because they considered it federal intrusion into states' rights to deal with the elections and to define the electorate. If the Constitution could compel allowing women to vote, might it compel allowing blacks to vote, they asked. At the same time, we also see women much more prominently engaged in professionalizing social welfare, the provision of relief to the needy. Only private relief was practiced in the South through families, charity organizations like the YMCA, the YWCA, and churches doing home missions work. Governments were loath to spend public funds on relief, including creation of almshouses. Some almshouses existed, as did Confederate soldiers' homes, but these provided minimum of care for very few people who had no other source of maintenance. Women took leading roles in providing poor relief, particularly through churches, then by employment with businesses such as mills that provided social welfare in their mill villages. These women directed programs in recreation and education. Similarly, the settlement house movement made inroads into the South. In 1899, the New Orleans Episcopal Diocese established Kingsley House in the destitute Irish Channel of that city. Kingsley House director Eleanor McMain drew it away from the church in 1902 and promoted campaigns for the area such as clubs, classes, a medical clinic, and campaigned for municipal ordinances to regulate child labor, improve tenement houses, establish mosquito control, make a municipal recreation program, and create a council of social agencies to effectively distribute relief and conduct studies. Now, I have a special affinity for Kingsley House. My aunt worked there for her entire career as a social worker, and I spent many summer vacations hanging out in Kingsley House. The charity organization movement grew after 1900, devoted to scientific charity based on casework and organizing existing charity work in local communities. Not only did these reformers think the haves had an obligation to relieve the have-nots, but that scientific charity promoted rehabilitation from poverty and prevention of it in individual cases of hard luck. Gradually, this kind of work led to more regularized and rationalized welfare providing, which demanded training and expertise. State organizations formed to spread information, provide professional development, and connect charity workers with physicians who began to lead efforts and treat welfare as it did individual medical problems through casework models. Another branch of this work developed to advocate for laws to promote the welfare of the weak, such as workers' compensation laws, anti-tuberculosis laws, and health state codes, as well as child welfare laws. The profession of social worker emerged from this activity, but did not make much headway until after World War I. Finally, some progressive men promoted interracial cooperation and racial uplift campaigns, though these were always paternalistic. Studies of African American life in the South, the conditions brought about by segregation and social and economic debility, and the striving of African Americans to better their own lot kept at least some spark of humanity in view, while offering an admittedly weak counterpoint to the exceptional racial violence of the era. Much of the racial uplift work in the South was associated with Tuskegee Institute in Alabama under the guidance of Booker T. Washington. Washington's mantra was that blacks must prepare themselves for citizenship by uplifting their economic abilities and eschewing politics. Others, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who had taught in Atlanta, asked African Americans to educate themselves and demand their political rights as citizens. Washington seemed to Du Bois like an accommodationist, and I see that point. But it is known that Washington quietly supported political efforts, and one scholar recently made a compelling argument to me that Washington was as much a black nationalist as Marcus Garvey. Regardless, Tuskegee worked completely within the confines of the segregation regime and found a significant support for its programs from Northern philanthropists, as well as commendations from Southern progressives. Under the rubrics of social efficiency and economic development, Southern progressives champion many reforms that we can organize into municipal reform campaigns and campaigns to expand state services. So let's examine these. Though the South was highly rural, even after World War I, towns and cities held outsized influence and were the center of new activities. Part of this was because of the growth of the press, which occurred in towns and cities and so told the stories of their localities. Part of it, too, was because of the growth of organizations like chambers of commerce, professional societies, and civic organizations like Kiwanis and Rotary. Such groups paid attention to the problems the growth of cities and towns experienced and sought solutions. Many of these defined progressive activism. In the spirit of the age, of rationalizing procedures and relying on expertise and study to solve problems, the effect of reform, and its goal actually, was to depoliticize and professionalize city government. That is, to take the politics, the machines, and the political hacks out of power, replacing them with experts in city functions. We see this in the city commission movement that we've spoken about already, but let me summarize it again. Cities were run by councils elected to represent geographical districts of the city. So politics rather than ability or expertise was at a premium. After the failures of the Galveston, Texas Council to recover from the 1900 hurricane there, businessmen secured a new form of government, the city commission, in which commissioners were elected to take charge of city departments. They often were elected at large rather than from a ward or a district. This form spread to 500 cities by 1920, and some cities still use a modified version of the commission system today. Like we discussed under national progressivism, this was a movement for greater city efficiency and usually required charter reform. There were separate movements for efficiencies in cities that didn't go to changing the council form of government, and there were city campaigns to reform charters for other reasons too. Another municipal reform campaign was cleaning up of vice, meaning liquor and prostitution. Early in the era, reformers thought that corralling vice into specific districts was the way to control it. Some districts already existed and were expanded or more tightly controlled. The legendary Storyville section of New Orleans, shown on the background of this slide, is a good example, as is the controlling of the red light district of Mobile, Alabama. During the era, as prohibitionists held sway and as federal soldiers moved into the South for training or deployment in World War I, reformers campaigned to eradicate saloons and red light districts. Neither was successful at wiping out vice and probably made prostitution more problematic, but it did remove the tacit blessing of the municipality from them. Improving services such as fire and police protection, streets, hospitalization, water and sewerage was its own body of reform. These campaigns tended to follow similar tracks. A group identified a problem or decided to champion fixing a known problem. They began agitating and educating, a common phrase taken from the Knights of Labor, for change. They succeeded in bringing in powerful local allies, and someone in the government began championing their cause. An example of this phenomenon is John Kraft of Mobile. He was a wholesale grocer who pioneered the banana trade between Central America and Mobile and got the businesses along Dauphine Street to contribute to having their road paved with cypress blocks. This got him elected to the Mobile City Council and later its commission regularly from 1874 to 1911. He led the building of the municipal waterworks, installation of sanitary sewers. He established a professional fire department. He rehabilitated the city hospital, and he instituted the first survey of all fisheries in Alabama. He is best known for his work on good roads and ended his days as a state senator, serving there from 1919 to 1933. The first concrete road built in Alabama was named for him. Also, like the National Progressive Movement, Southern progressives sought to expand the role of government. Many of the projects they considered necessary required more financial or legal ability than any state or county could provide. And eventually, Southern progressives also recognized that the federal government had roles to play in improving life. This is not to say they didn't continue to resent federal intrusion, but they sure did like federal recognition and money. One example, based on my own research, is the Alabama Good Roads movement. From 1898 to 1906, individuals and small organizations agitated for taxpayers to get their county governments to improve local roads. In 1906, they coalesced into the Alabama Good Roads Association, and in 1907, convinced the Alabama legislature to authorize a state highway commission to coordinate road building and improvement. That commission organized in 1911 and provided grants and direction to counties. In 1916, Alabama's Senator John Bankhead finally succeeded in passing a federal aid road bill that provided federal funds to states for road building. The 1921 Federal Highway Act, advocated by state and national good roads groups, secured the American highway funding mechanism that we use today. Public health reform is the last expansion of state services that we'll examine. Most cities, counties, and states had public health departments at least by the end of World War I, but they were often tiny and seriously underfunded. As late as 1918, for example, Alabama appropriated more to eradicate cattle ticks than it did for its public health services. The campaign that cranked up the viability of robust public health concerns was the anti-hookworm campaign. Hookworm is an intestinal parasite transmitted by contact with human feces. Because so many farms did not have sanitary privies, latrines were subject to flooding and overfilling, and because so many went barefoot, hookworm infested thousands across the South. It was responsible for the so-called Southern laziness that so many people blasted. In 1902, the U.S. Public Health Service identified hookworm disease, and medical professionals surveyed its extent. North Carolina revealed in 1912, for instance, that hookworm was a significant problem in 99 of its 100 counties. In 1909, Southerners prevailed upon the Rockefeller Foundation to fund an eradication campaign, which committed up to $1 million in grants to states. From 1909 until 1914, states and local health boards conducted surveys, gave demonstrations, and set up treatment facilities. Across the region, over 1 million people were examined, and almost 500,000 were treated. There was resistance. Some people thought Northern philanthropy was patronizing and condescending, but the results of the anti-hookworm campaign stifled those voices. The campaign led to one in the 1920s against pellagra, which was the devastating result of a diet too low in niacin. So in summary, the progressives of the South from 1890 until about 1920 shared many similarities of action and concerns with the progressive movement across the United States. Progressives everywhere were consumed with reforming the society that was developing from industrialization during the Gilded Age and seemed to be taking root with all of its problems and dislocations and strife. Progressives were overwhelmingly middle class and were conscious of their lack of a place in society of labor and capitalists. But as they grew as a class, they began to seize initiatives that eventually led to establishing themselves as economic, political, and social leaders. They were able to write their preferences into law in many cases, and progressives created the system of government and even the culture that extended into the 21st century. We examined Southern progressivism as a separate, if not distinct, phenomenon, and looked at how Southern progressives operated. The most telling circumstances that distinguished Southern progressivism from any other was its connections to Jim Crow and white supremacy. Even its racial uplift campaigns provided only what so-called white establishment allowed. The lack of a large local upper class to fight so that progressives' ire turned to northern corporations, and the dominance of the rural population. Progressivism was principally an urban phenomenon, so its southern manifestations were generally reduced, or they occurred later than elsewhere. This then ends the lecture. As always, thanks for your attention.